like our previous speaker was talking about. And these communities, native plant communities, are much more hardy and will do great in these sites once established. So the idea is, let's think long-term savings here. Now, some other reasons why native plants are a great resource for these BMPs. Wildlife habitat. Surface roughness is an important aspect. If you look at these two swales, you can imagine the flume on the left. Water's going to run down that pretty quickly, whereas a similarly situated site that's fully vegetated, water goes slow. It gives it a chance to infiltrate, gives it a chance to process. And if nothing else, it slows it down from entering our creeks, our streams, and waterways, and giving us a little bit of flood retention. Here's another site where you might think, okay, on the left, this is kind of could be a standard stormwater detention facility. Well, this is a wetland complex that once the species were developed, you can just see that there's a lot more retention of the water. There's water processing going on. Deep roots of native species. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here for a little bit, but you know, native species are, for the most part, prairie adapted plants that will put down really deep. This helps condition our soil, replaces organic matter, increases water infiltration, and again, this all really helps for water quality. One thing I love about this slide is the fescue turf on the left versus the buffalo grass on the right. I mean, what an amazing difference. And how many of our stormwater BMPs are full of cool season turf grasses that we could get buffalo grass or similar natives in there that would give that root structure and provide these benefits. Also, if you're talking about assemblages of native communities, you know, they have more biomass, create more water uptake. Again, that's storage. Nutrient delay, nutrient removal. You know, nitrogen and phosphorus gets pulled into these plants. It's utilized by these plants. Sure, they might die and return to the water eventually, but a lot of times this happens during periods of the year when nutrients aren't as big of a problem. In the wintertime, they might decompose early in the spring, so it delays that nutrient flow. And also, there's no reason you can't mow and hay these areas and literally remove that nutrient from the system entirely. Use it as compost somewhere. And you know, this is more of a personal aesthetic, but I think they just look better. They have a fuller look, again, in these assemblages. There's no reason you can't do more, standard kind of traditional landscaping with native species. That works just fine too. But these assemblages of natives, once established, have that weed competition. They look good. They look full. So to wrap up, my case for natives. When should you use it on a stormwater system? Well, that's easy. Anytime you have plants. There's no reason not to use them. Bioretention cells, rain gardens, bioswales, stormwater wetlands, even grass filter strips can be great places for native species. So I would ask the question, when shouldn't you be using them? All right, here's a couple examples of some stormwater BMPs where natives are being successfully employed. Here's a mid-sized rain garden. It's taken the water from two residential roofs, and it becomes established. And sure, it's got kind of a wild look, and that this isn't maybe belong in all places, but you can manage that. You can manage that. You can get a maintenance regime in place where the wildness is tempered. But hey, in my backyard, I'd love to have something like that. All right, so another more kind of physical extreme where we've successfully implemented native plants. This is a wet swale with drop structures, huge erosion potential and flow potential. There's no reason we can't establish natives here, and we have. Bioretention cells, getting water off of parking lots and lawn that probably has fertilizer and pesticides on it. Again, we can establish native plants here and have. So take the long view. A little extra work early on in your design and in your your maintenance of those first few years, and you get a big long-term savings. You get improved quality of water, and of course that's the big long-term savings that we're looking at here. You also get improved performance of your BMP because you're getting more of those benefits from the species than you would in just a vegetated swale or a gravel swale. Maintenance costs in the long run are lower. In the short term, you've got to put a little bit extra effort into it. But over the 3+ years, your maintenance will go down significantly. So let's jump in. I've talked about native species. Hopefully I've sold you on it. I've got a lot of stuff to consider in the next few slides, some planning, design, maintenance. There's a lot of factors here. So I just want to take a step back, take a breath, and think about it like flossing. Everybody knows they should floss, and most people don't, and everybody's got their reasons why they don't like to floss and whatever, But really, it's not that hard, and it's really beneficial. And once you get into the habit of flossing, it's really actually pretty easy. You just got to get in the habit, got to get used to doing it. And this is the same thing. Establishing, if you work with stormwater BMPs, once you get used to implementing native plants as a solution there, it becomes easy. It becomes second nature because really most of us, we don't work on a huge variety of things. So if you focus on it, you start to get familiar with some species that you can throw in your design, and you get familiar with the kind of maintenance requirements that are needed and the things to watch out for, and it becomes easy. It becomes second nature. All right, so quick word or two on planning. Early on, when you're thinking about doing BMP work, if your site is small, and of course BMPs can cover a huge, you could be talking a couple 100 square foot rain garden all the way up to a multiple acre retention basin. So when you're thinking small, plan on putting a little extra effort into the appearance. What you want a grass flower assemblage, is it going to be sedge heavy? Do you want it to have bloom times that range the entire season so that people walking by on a trail or sitting in the backyard are going to always have blooms? And think about maintenance. What are the expectations and for how this is going to look? And make sure that you're ready to make that happen maintenance-wise. Because again, with these species, you got to put a little extra effort in up front to make that savings in the long run. And of course, there's landscape context. How does it fit into the larger landscape? Now, in larger BMPs, you need to focus on function. You might need to get into a little bit of engineering. You need to be aware of your hydrology. You don't want to be flooding out your plants, and you don't want to put a bunch of plants that don't do well in arid spaces in a stormwater site that's going to draw down and be dry most of the year. So you got to be ready for that. Think about conditions, environmental tolerances, salt coming off roadways, frequency and flood duration, that sort of thing. But on these larger sites, also consider, okay, where are the high traffic edges? Where are people going to see this site? Most of these stormwater BMPs, these are in urban areas, so of course we're going to have high visibility in some aspect of it. So maybe do a little more traditional planting of native shrubs along the edge to give it a little bit of a buffer, or have like a buffalo grass area, or maybe some pollinators in there and call it your butterfly garden. These kinds of things will help these larger BMPs be successful and accepted by the community. And again, when it comes to the community, signage and education is always a good component to keep in mind. Just like we're learning where we can fit these native species into our stormwater BMPs, people in the community are learning too, and everybody knows what a lawn looks like, and that's why I think a lot of our stormwater BMPs are designed to look like lawns. Well, if it doesn't look like that, is it failing? What's going on? Put some signs out there, get the education out so that people understand what we're trying to achieve here. All right, sourcing plants can be a little bit tricky because a lot of times nurseries won't have a lot of good stock in the nursery. When it comes to seed, and I'm a big advocate of using seed mixes. because you can get a good assemblage of species for a good price in there. And they're easier to come by than live plants. So with seeds, you got to find a good, reputable, established supplier. Make sure that they have fresh seed, and you know, there's a lot of good businesses that cater to the egg community out there that can provide native seed. But if it's a bag that's been sitting in the back of the shed for 3 years, you don't want to waste your time on that. And you know, and think about where it's coming from. You can get native seed from the East Coast. And so you got to be careful. Again, a reputable supplier is going to sell you that. But you can open up a magazine and get all sorts of native, you know, stuff that isn't really local, and you want something as local as possible. When it comes to using live plants, if you use plugs are really small. They come in containers that are about the size of my pinky, and they're really easy to plant and they're really easy to kill. So you want to grow them up. We've got some arrowhead here that we're growing before putting it in the ground. Really, when it comes to living plants, you know, 1 gallon size or larger is a good thing to look for. And avoid nativars. You know, nurseries love to sell you stuff that's like, hey, it's bee balm, but it's bright red, so isn't that great? Well, yeah, but we don't know, you know, what we're putting into the ground. It could be, you know, it could be the next big invasive for all we know, or it might not have the environmental tolerances that we would expect to have from that species. So again, is it truly a native plant, or is it some hybridized version of one? You just got to be careful about that. When it comes to shrubs and trees, get shrubs or trees that are grown with a air prune system, air prune roots. There's a lot of different names for this, and a lot of different companies do it. But instead of having a large taproot, you basically, the air pruning forces the taproot to create a whole lot of fresh, healthy growth up near the surface. And so these shrubs and trees are a lot more hardy than otherwise. And then there's what I like to call the Goldilocks zone of size. If you put tiny little whips in, they're not very hardy, and they're, you know, a big windstorm knocks them over and they're growing sideways. It doesn't work so great. If it's too big, if you've got a $300 ball and burlap tree you're putting out there, it's also not hardy because it's spent its entire life in a nursery getting pampered, and you just stuck it out in the ground and it's going to be dry for 3 weeks. All right, so, you know, look for something. I like to use the 1 to 2 year old stock. It's cheap, it's adaptable, it can deal with a little bit more stress, it's easy to plant a lot of it. These areas you're going to have some dieback, plant on it. You know, put 150% in the ground, and then evaluate when the next year comes along. Because a lot of times we're not going to be out there watering these sites, you know, especially on bigger ones, with a hose every other day. So a couple of resources, sourcing plants. Again, find a reputable supplier. Prairie Moon in Minnesota has this cultural guide, they call it, which is a spreadsheet of native plant information. It's phenomenal. It's free. It's available. Check it out. It's perfect. USDA Plants is a good place for, you know, finding information on the nativity, you know, where they're local to, where certain plants are introduced. And then our website, evink.consulting, has a Iowa Tree Natural Ranges web app, and you can use that to look anywhere in Iowa and see get a list of native shrubs and trees for that area. Check it out. All right, so when it comes to design, a few considerations. You know, I could have a full day workshop on design, of course, so I'm just blowing through this stuff just to kind of get you thinking about it. You know, obviously you want to have good soil conditions before you put any kind of seed or plant mix down. When it comes to using seed, native seed has to be planted. It needs good seed soil contact, and you don't want to bury it too deep. So if you use a seed drill, it can't be an agricultural seed drill. It needs to be a native seed drill with a hopper, and it basically just pushes the seed just down into the soil, almost not even at all. It just kind of puts it in contact with it. Is the way to go, especially on a big site. Broadcasting is also an excellent option. Mix your seed with moist sand. broadcast it by hand, put it in a hopper behind a tractor and ATV. And what we found is that that seed will grow, especially if it's dormant. It can work into the soil over the wintertime. But if you have a roller that you can come behind and just kind of push it into the ground, you'll have much better results with the growth of that seed. Think about nurse crops. We like to use seed oats during the summertime or winter wheat or dormant plantings. Helps provide a little bit of cover, helps retain the soil moisture when the seeds are just starting. Think about when you're siting a stormwater BMP, potential weed vectors. Because if you're next to a creek that's surrounded by Phragmites and Rica berry grass and purple loosestrife and a patch of Japanese knotweed over there, this might not be a great site for a place where you're going to try to establish natives, because these things are going to blow away your maintenance budget. So keep that in mind. Think about ways to mitigate for that. You can spend anywhere from $200 to $2,000 an acre. Do you really need that great, grand mix that everybody wants to see grow on a site that's going to be pretty rough environment? No. A lot of times a good wet mesic CRP mix that's fairly cheap is going to work in a lot of these sites. But you look at it, see, you want to get something that's going to work in your site. And when it comes to fertilizer, just don't use it, ever. Native plants, they do fine without it. And that extra nutrient will help your weedy, aggressive species come in. If there's any cool season grasses or ragweed or anything like that in there, the fertilizer will help that and not your native plants. And think about a border. Simple borders work. And especially in these BMPs that are a little bit rougher, a little bit wilder looking, because you've got, some taller plants, a lot of stuff going on. You want to make sure that you can kind of keep a clean edge, and that really helps people out with their expectations. Likewise, we have a really nice prairie planted here, and we've got, city mowers coming through. They do a great job. There's no border, so they just go to where they mowed last time, maybe a little bit extra because they're doing a good job. Well, one full season later, we just lost about 5 feet of a pretty expensive prairie planting for an entire stretch of trail. So again, borders are important. So I'm going to talk about species selection a little bit. Diversity, use diversity. We're talking ecological niches. Try to get those filled so that this community is a healthier, stronger community. Think about appearance. There's a lot that can go into that. What are you expecting to get from this site? And environmental tolerances. Judy in the next talk will talk more about some of these things, but can your plants handle the loads that are going to be coming into this site? And perhaps most importantly out of these is hydrology, the depth, duration, and frequency of water events in these areas. Large sites typically need zones. If you think about a dry detention basin that might fill up 3 to 5 feet during a big rain event and then dry out, all right? Zones can help you manage that, and I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide. Wetland status indicator is a great resource. Most of these plants have this. It's provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service. On small sites, as a rule of thumb, you don't want obligate or upland plants. I'm going to explain obligate is plants that pretty much grow out of standing water all the time. Upland plants are going to be your dry, arid plants. And in stormwater BMPs, of course, you're going to have flushes of water. They're going to be saturated for periods of time, but a lot of times they dry out within 12 to 24 hours. And so then you have a dry period. So we've got to have a little bit of flood tolerance, a lot of drought tolerance, and a lot of these BMPs. So generally the facultative plants do the best in that situation. Again, zones. If you think of this site as, it could be one big flat detention basin. Well, instead, what we've done here is we've identified areas where we can plan to have consistent standing water. And actually, Judy's going to talk a lot more about this site in the next presentation. Now we've got fluctuation zones on the edge and freeboard zones that can manage our high water events. and you can put your planting plan accordingly to put correct and appropriate plants in each zone. This is an excellent resource. I want to call it out to all of your attention if you're interested in any of this stuff, especially when it comes to native plant tolerances of these things. Great resource. So a few other considerations. Seeds won't grow and stay in water. You need to design a bypass. Can you take it offline? Are control structures appropriate? And design for adaptive plantings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in our case study. Of course, you want to be aware of slopes and seed movement. Do we need the hydromulch? Do we need erosion control blankets or other features on your site? You don't want to wash them down over your seed, over your plants you put in. And design for maintenance. If you need to mow it regularly, make it accessible to a mower. And this is for you engineers out there. When SUDAS is our statewide urban design and specifications manual, it calls for type 2 cool season seed used when you need to stabilize urban areas. That's a nightmare when it comes to native plant establishment, because these cool season grasses will rush into your planting and take over and grow before the warm season natives can get firmly established. So you just got to be aware of it. Again, SUDAS also recommends fertilizer in most, if not all, of these places, so you just got to be aware this could be a problem. Fertilizer will make it harder for the native plants to actually get established because they'll have higher trouble. And likewise, be aware of good-natured contractors. I'm a contractor, I'm one of them, that have seed in their back pocket. I've worked on a lot of sites where any contractor that's going to do any kind of grading, digging, any kind of disturbance is throwing seed down behind them to stabilize that site. And they're saving everybody a lot of trouble by making sure that that's not a SWIP problem, that site's getting stabilized. They're probably using that type 2 cool season mix. And they might be using an older version that has bird's foot trefoil in it, which is even worse. All right, so as a quick case study here, this is Coralville. Coral Ridge Mall is I believe it's still the second largest mall in the state. And its roofs and parking lot essentially make up the watershed that feeds into a drainage straight down into Clear Creek. There's an outlet and a 1,700-foot linear ditch. It's a vegetated ditch that basically shoots that water straight down into the creek. So what we want to do is create a stormwater wetland that took some of that water and managed it in a better way. So we'll zoom in on this area. And again, here's where the typical flow down into our creek would occur and you could just imagine all that water hitting the mall would just rush down into that stream. So what we did is create a bypass structure that pushes the normal flow through a wetland system where it can disperse and infiltrate and and feed all sorts of plants and before it returns to the creek. And honestly, I think I made this arrow on the bottom going into the creek a little too big because you never really see it flowing back in. It's all pretty much infiltrated by that time. And what's great about this site too is that we utilize the ditch so that if there's big events, really big events, we don't have it blowing through our system and creating scour and whatever else. So they can still bypass, the big events can still bypass. But the majority of our water that flows off that mall is getting treated in this area. So we've got zones in this area. We've got kind of an emergent ponded zone with some flow in the middle where you might have one type of planting. And we've got fluctuations. We've got a wet prairie and a forested floodplain area along the edges where we have some fluctuation and where we generally have continuous saturation. And then we've got a prairie buffer that's along the trail to the south there, and there's a parking lot to the north where all the tailgaters for the Hawkeyes come. And this is our buffer zone where we've got a nicer prairie mix with a lot of flowers blooming, and it provides an area for that trash from our tailgaters to collect before it makes it down into the wetland. So here's a picture of the site graded. You can see the zones. Doing a little seed bed preparation, make sure it's ready for our seed. We broadcast seed on there and put oats in it to stabilize and to grow, create a nurse crop. We also use on this site straw to crimp straw in with light disking, and this again helps to kind of keep everything in place until that seed can get established. And we've got stabilization here with some green up and fully vegetated after, this was a couple of years into it because we have the trees in there. So on this site, we used an adaptive planting plan. We used 3 seed mixes. One for a kind of a general hybrid mix that went throughout the entire site. We had a sedge-only custom mix that we put in the wetter areas where we tended to have longer periods of saturation. And then we used that buffer mix, that more high-dollar prairie mix along the edges to get those forbs in. And typically on a site like this, we'll delay planting the trees for a year, just to make sure that the hydrology is good and that we're not going to drown out all of our trees. We've got a good diversity of trees in here, but if the site is just a little bit wetter than we think, well, they're gonna die. So maybe we need to go out there and put some little islands or humps or berms in there if we really want to have that kind of forest component. And this side we didn't need to. All right, so real quickly, a couple of things to keep in mind. Early priorities on these sites. We want to encourage root growth. These are perennials. They take the first couple of years to put roots down. You want to increase available sun. You want to reduce weed competition. And likewise, manage disturbance. Height-adjusted mowing or tall mowings, the first couple of years are key. That keeps your annual weeds under control and gets sun exposure to those rosettes that are growing down low after those first couple of years. Annual weed management is handled primarily through this mowing. And by annual, I mean annuals, weeds that are annual. Perennial plants that are weeds, those are the ones you need to identify early and hand row. Because if you've got Phragmites out there, you need to kill it right away. And it'll pop up anywhere. It could have come in on construction equipment, you don't know. And likewise, sweep all equipment. Have your contractors sweep all their equipment. That mower might have just been mowing down a patch of Canada thistle combined with sweet grass or sweet clover and Lord knows what else. And it's driving right into your site. So make sure that they are out there sweeping that equipment off before they go into your native planting. Erosion inspection is key, and manage expectations. The first couple of years, again, you want to keep the site mowed tall so that those perennials can grow. And people think, well, I thought you were putting a butterfly garden out here, but in fact, it's this big, kind of tall, weedy mess. Well, that's just, it takes a couple of years to get established. And again, don't use fertilizer. Burning is a great resource. These are fire-adapted species. Otherwise, you can always get out there and mow it and rake it off. Here's a smaller site. On a bigger site, again, a dormant mow can be really beneficial. If you've got a site where saplings from willows and silver maples and cottonwoods are coming in and overrunning a site, a dormant mow each year is a cheap way to keep that under control if you can't burn. And with that, here's the resources I mentioned earlier. If you didn't get a chance to copy of those. And I probably don't have any time for questions, but I appreciate you listening to my talk.